Sunday dinners in our family always began the same way, with the illusion of warmth carefully set on the table like polished silverware. The house smelled of roasted chicken and rosemary, the kind of smell that pretends nothing sharp will be said once everyone sits down. Mom moved between the kitchen and dining room with practiced ease. Dad unfolded his napkin like it was a ritual, and Sarah arrived 10 minutes late, glowing with that familiar confidence that filled the room before she even spoke. I slipped into my chair quietly, the way I always did, already bracing myself for the unspoken roles we were about to perform. The conversation drifted lazily at first. Traffic, weather, a neighbor's new dog. Then, right on cue, Sarah reached for her phone. She didn't announce what she was about to do, but she never had to. We all leaned in instinctively. Trained by years of repetition, she swiped through photos of her kitchen renovation, each image brighter and more impressive than the last. Marble countertops gleamed under perfect lighting. Custom cabinets stood flush and immaculate, and the backsplash shimmered like it belonged in a design magazine. "It's amazing what homeownership lets you do," Sarah said, her voice casual but precise. "Every upgrade just adds more value. Equity builds whether you're paying attention or not." She paused just long enough for the sentence to land. "It's so different from renting. All that money just disappears every month, and there's nothing to show for it." Mom smiled and passed the potatoes, her pride visible in the way her shoulders lifted. "Sarah's always been smart with money," she said. "She thinks long term, always has." I kept eating, nodding faintly, my eyes on my plate. I'd learned long ago that silence was safer than defense. To them, I was predictable. Emma, the quiet one, the underachiever, the daughter who worked at what they believed was a small consulting firm, drove a 3-year-old Honda Civic, and rented an apartment in a part of town they politely referred to as up and coming. Dad cleared his throat and joined in, slicing his chicken with a little more force than necessary. "At some point, you have to start thinking about the future," he said, not looking at me at first. "You can't rent forever. You're 29 now. Most successful people your age are investing in real assets, not paying someone else's mortgage." Sarah leaned back, folding her arms loosely. The picture of relaxed success. "It's not easy for everyone," she added, her smile sympathetic in a way that felt rehearsed. "Not everyone has the credit score or savings for a down payment. The requirements are steep these days. But there are programs for first-time buyers, even for people in different situations." The word different hung in the air like a thin veil. Uncle Robert, who never missed a chance to contribute when my life was under review, nodded from across the table. "The market's brutal right now," he said. "You need solid income, perfect credit, real discipline. Some people just aren't built for that level of responsibility." I took another bite of green beans and swallowed slowly. "You're probably right," I said softly, the response I'd perfected over years of dinners like this. Sarah smiled, satisfied. "Don't get me wrong. Renting isn't bad. Some people prefer fewer responsibilities. Maintenance, taxes, insurance, hero fees. It's a lot. Homeownership really requires financial sophistication." Mom reached over and patted my hand. Her touch was gentle, but her eyes carried disappointment she didn't try to hide. "You could start small," she said. "A condo, maybe something manageable. If she can qualify," Dad muttered, not quite under his breath. The rest of the evening followed its usual rhythm. Sarah talked about her promotion, her 5-year plan, the next upgrade she wanted to make, a bigger house someday, a pool, a 3-car garage. I listened, nodded when addressed, stayed in my lane. By the time dessert arrived, I felt the familiar heaviness settle in my chest. The quiet understanding that nothing I did tonight would change how they saw me. As dishes were cleared, Sarah caught me alone in the kitchen. "I hope you didn't take what Dad said personally," she said, lowering her voice. "He just wants the best for you." "We all do." "I know," I replied. "Rinsing plates? If you ever want help getting pre-approved or talking to a real estate agent, let me know. I know someone great. She's really patient, especially with limited budgets." I smiled and thanked her, the mask slipping easily back into place. The drive home was quiet. Streetlights blurred past as I replayed the evening in my mind, not because anything new had happened, but because everything had happened exactly as expected. These dinners had followed the same script for years. Sarah showcased success. The family praised her. I absorbed the judgment. What none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that for the past 2 years, I had been paying Sarah's mortgage. It had started with a phone call late one night. Sarah crying, her voice breaking as she explained that her job wasn't as stable as she'd believed. Department eliminated. 3 months without income. A $3, 200 mortgage payment looming. She begged me not to tell anyone. Her image mattered more than anything, and I helped, believing it would be temporary. Now, as I pulled into my apartment parking lot, I sat in my car for a moment before turning off the engine. The building was modest, quiet, unimpressive, and exactly right for me. Upstairs, my laptop waited with spreadsheets, income reports, and property summaries my family had never seen. The life I lived in silence was solid, steady, and real, even if no one at that table believed it. Sunday dinner was over, but the story was only beginning. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains of my bedroom in a way that always felt honest. It wasn't dramatic or luxurious, just steady and soft. The kind of light that didn't pretend to be anything more than it was. I lay still for a few moments, listening to the muted sounds of the city waking up, and let my breathing settle into its familiar rhythm. Nights after Sunday dinners were always like this, quiet on the surface, restless underneath, not because of what was said, but because of how effortlessly everyone said it. As if my life had already been reviewed and filed away without my input. In the kitchen, I brewed coffee and opened my laptop at the small dining table that doubled as my workspace. The screen came alive with numbers, charts, and neatly organized folders, rental income reports, maintenance schedules, notes from my property manager. This was the part of my life no one asked about, the part that didn't fit the version of me they'd decided on years ago. To them, I was drifting. To me, I was building something that didn't require applause. As the coffee cooled, my phone buzzed. A message from Mom. She thanked me for coming to dinner, added a heart emoji, and gently reminded me that it's never too late to start thinking bigger. I stared at the screen for a moment before setting the phone face down. The irony sat heavy in my chest. Bigger, in their language, always meant louder, more visible, easier to brag about at family gatherings. By mid-morning, I was deep into my routine. Emails answered, payments confirmed, a quick call with Janet, my property manager, who handled the daily details so I could focus on strategy. She mentioned a minor plumbing issue in one of the duplexes and a new tenant application that looked promising. Her voice was calm and professional, and the conversation grounded me in reality, the kind that didn't revolve around perception. Yet my thoughts kept drifting back to the dinner table, to Sarah's smile, to Dad's comments, to the way advice had been offered without ever being asked for. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from being constantly underestimated, especially by people who believe they're helping. Over time, you stop correcting them. You stop explaining. Silence becomes easier than fighting assumptions that seem carved in stone. Sarah hadn't always been like this. Growing up, she was driven, organized, the one teachers praised and relatives admired. I was quieter, more observant, content to work behind the scenes. Somewhere along the way, those differences hardened into labels: successful and struggling, smart and uncertain. And once a family decides who you are, it takes something drastic to change their minds. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was Sarah. A cheerful message about how nice it was to have everyone together and how Mom had loved the dinner. She added a quick note about the new backsplash and hinted at a bathroom renovation she was seriously considering. I felt a familiar tightness in my stomach. Renovations cost money, money she didn't have, money that, more often than not, came from me. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I stared out the window at the parking lot below, at my car. Unremarkable and reliable, appearances had always fooled them. They assumed modest meant struggling. They assumed quiet meant unsure. They assumed renting meant failing, and I'd let them, partly because correcting them would have required unraveling a story that had grown far too complicated. The truth was, helping Sarah had stopped feeling like help a long time ago. What began as support during a crisis had slowly turned into something else, something heavier. Each month, the transfer went through automatically. 3. Tuinant. No questions. No acknowledgement at family dinners. No mention when she lectured me about financial responsibility. The imbalance gnawed at me, not just financially, but emotionally. Around noon, I took a break and stepped outside. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain. I walked a few blocks, letting my thoughts wander. How long was I supposed to keep this up? How long was I responsible for protecting Sarah's image at the cost of my own peace? Families had a way of turning quiet generosity into invisible obligation. By the time I returned home, the answer felt closer, though not fully formed. I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was simply tired. Tired of being the safety net no one acknowledged. Tired of listening to advice from someone living beyond her means. Tired of funding a lifestyle that looked impressive but rested on borrowed ground. That evening, as the sky darkened, I opened my budgeting software and reviewed my numbers. Everything was solid, sustainable, built on patience rather than performance. I could continue supporting Sarah without damaging my finances. But the question wasn't whether I could, it was whether I should. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, the room quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to consider a future where my role in the family changed, where silence was no longer my default, where help came with boundaries. The thought was unsettling, but also strangely comforting, like the first deep breath after holding one too long. Outside, the city lights flickered on, one by one. Somewhere across town, Sarah was likely planning her next upgrade, confident the ground beneath her feet would hold. She didn't see the cracks yet. Neither did my parents. But I did, and once you see them, it becomes impossible to pretend they aren't there. I washed my mug, turned off the lights, and headed to bed, my mind quieter than it had been the night before. The story hadn't shifted yet, but something inside me had, a realization, slow and steady, was taking shape. And soon, it would demand to be heard. Sleep came easily that night, the kind that settles in slowly and stays. But I woke before my alarm with a familiar heaviness in my chest. Not anxiety exactly, more like anticipation, the sense that something long avoided was inching closer to the surface. I lay still for a few moments, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the building around me. Somewhere above, someone walked across their apartment. Somewhere below, a door closed. Ordinary sounds, grounding and real, reminding me that my life, the one I actually lived, existed far beyond the assumptions made around my parents' dinner table. I got up, showered, dressed simply, and moved through my morning routine with practiced efficiency. There was comfort in repetition, comfort in knowing what came next. By the time I poured my coffee, my mind had settled enough to focus on the day ahead. Monday meant numbers, decisions, momentum. It meant stepping into the version of myself no one in my family ever saw. At my desk, I opened the dashboard that summarized everything I owned and managed. 17 properties, each one acquired deliberately, each one a step forward. Duplexes, small apartment buildings, modest single-family homes in neighborhoods where demand stayed steady regardless of trends. I hadn't chased prestige. I'd chased stability. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And more importantly, it let me sleep at night. Janet's email was already waiting. She outlined a few routine updates and flagged one unit that might need a roof inspection before winter. I responded quickly, approving the expense without hesitation. Preventative maintenance had saved me more money than any clever trick ever could. It was one of those lessons you learned early or paid for later. As the morning unfolded, the weight from Sunday dinner faded into the background. Work had a way of doing that. It reminded me of who I was when no one was watching, when no one was comparing me to my sister or measuring my success by visible markers. Here, results spoke quietly for themselves. Just before noon, my phone buzzed. Sarah again. A picture this time. A sleek tile pattern laid out on a showroom floor. Thinking about this for the bathroom? She wrote. Clean, modern, adds value. I stared at the image longer than I needed to. It wasn't the renovation itself that bothered me. It was the certainty behind it. The assumption that she could plan, upgrade, invest, without ever calculating whether she truly could afford to. Because somewhere, deep down, she believed she wouldn't have to face that question. She never had. I typed a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. In the end, I sent something neutral. Looks nice. Then set the phone aside. The afternoon passed in a blur of calls and emails. By the time I closed my laptop, the sun had already dipped low, casting long shadows across the room. I leaned back in my chair and let the quiet settle in. This was the hour when thoughts tended to surface, when distractions fell away, and whatever I'd been avoiding found space to breathe. I thought back to the beginning, to that first call from Sarah, her voice trembling, her words tumbling over each other as she tried to explain what had happened. The layoff, the shock, the fear of losing the house she'd worked so hard to buy. I remembered how quickly I'd said yes, how natural it had felt to step in. She was my sister. She was in trouble. Of course I'd help. At the time, it hadn't felt like a sacrifice. I had the means. The transfer barely made a dent, and I believed her when she said it was temporary. A few months, maybe 6 at most. Just until she found her footing again. But months turned into a year into 2. The narrative shifted quietly. What had been a stopgap became an expectation, not spoken aloud, but assumed. And with each passing dinner, each comment about my supposed lack of ambition, the imbalance grew heavier. I stood and walked to the window, watching cars move steadily below. Everyone was going somewhere, everyone carrying their own version of the truth. Families often clung to the stories that made them comfortable, even when those stories no longer matched reality. Especially then, the hardest part wasn't the money, it was the silence. The way my support existed only in the shadows. The way Sarah's confidence was built, in part, on something she refused to acknowledge publicly. And the way I was expected to absorb criticism without ever revealing the full picture. There's a difference between humility and erasure. I'd crossed that line somewhere along the way. Later that evening, I made a simple dinner and ate alone at my small table. I didn't mind solitude. In fact, I preferred it, alone. I didn't have to perform. I didn't have to downplay or explain. I could simply exist. After cleaning up, I opened a notebook I rarely used anymore, not for numbers or plans, but for thoughts I needed to see written out. I didn't title the page. I just started writing. Questions. Mostly. How long is help still help if it prevents growth? When does loyalty become self-betrayal? Why was I so afraid of changing the story? The answers didn't come all at once. They never do. But as the page filled, something became clear. I wasn't angry at Sarah. I was angry at myself. For agreeing to a role that no longer fit. For staying silent because it was easier than disrupting the balance everyone else seemed so comfortable with. I closed the notebook and rested my hands on the cover. Outside, the city hummed softly, a steady backdrop to the thoughts settling inside me. I didn't know exactly what would come next. I didn't have a plan yet. But I knew this much. The current arrangement couldn't continue forever. Boundaries weren't punishments. They were clarifications. And soon, I would need to clarify mine. I turned off the lights and headed to bed, my mind quieter, but more resolved than it had been in years. Somewhere between sleep and wakefulness, one truth lingered. Silence had protected me for a long time, but it was no longer protecting me now. The next few days passed with deceptive calm. On the surface, everything looked the same. My routine didn't change. The automatic transfer still processed on schedule. Sarah continued her life uninterrupted, planning upgrades, posting cheerful updates, basking in the image she'd worked so hard to maintain. But beneath that calm, something fundamental had shifted inside me, like a quiet fault line finally becoming visible. Wednesday evening, I found myself lingering over dinner, pushing food around my plate while my thoughts circled the same question again and again. When had helping turned into enabling? The line was thin, almost invisible, and I'd crossed it without realizing. At first, I'd told myself I was giving Sarah time. Then I told myself it wasn't hurting me. Then, without noticing, I'd started telling myself it was my responsibility. Families are good at that. They assign roles early, and those roles come with expectations that feel almost moral. Sarah was the achiever. I was the backup. The safety net. The one who would quietly absorb whatever was too heavy for others to carry. That night, my phone rang. Sarah's name lit up the screen. I hesitated before answering, already bracing myself. "Hey," she said brightly. "I just got back from the design showroom. You wouldn't believe how expensive tile has gotten. But it's worth it. The right bathroom can really elevate a home." I closed my eyes briefly. "Sarah," I said carefully, "how are you planning to pay for all of this?" There was a pause, short but telling. "I'll figure it out," she replied. "I always do. Besides, it's an investment. You know that." I knew something else too. Investments only worked when the foundation beneath them was solid. Hers wasn't. After we hung up, I sat in silence, the weight of her words settling in. Figure it out. She didn't say how. She didn't say when. She didn't say alone. The assumption was clear, even if it went unspoken. The next morning, I opened my financial software again, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see the numbers with fresh eyes. The $3.200 monthly transfer sat there like a fixed point, immovable, unquestioned. Over 2 years, it added up to a sum large enough to buy another property outright, large enough to change someone's life. I wasn't resentful of the money itself. I was resentful of what it represented, a boundary I'd never drawn. By Friday, the decision had crystallized. It didn't arrive dramatically. There was no surge of anger, no moment of confrontation in my head, just a steady clarity that felt almost peaceful. I couldn't continue like this. Not because I was unable, but because I was unwilling. I made the call to Janet first. My voice was calm, businesslike. "I need you to stop processing the monthly transfer to Sarah's account starting next month." There was a brief pause. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "I can adjust the timing or change the account if there's a technical issue." "No technical issue," I said. "I'm ending the arrangement." "Understood," she replied without judgment. "Do you want me to notify her or will you handle it?" "I'll handle it." After hanging up, I sat back and let the reality of what I'd just done sink in. This wasn't a threat or a test. It was a line drawn clearly, perhaps for the first time in my life. I called my accountant next, confirming the implications of ending what had been recorded as a family loan. Everything was straightforward, clean. There was no hidden cost, no financial consequence that would ripple outward. The only uncertainty was emotional, and no spreadsheet could measure that. I waited until Sunday evening to call Sarah. I wanted the timing to be deliberate, not reactive. When she answered, her voice was cheerful, relaxed. "Hey, what's up?" "We need to talk about the mortgage payments," I said, skipping any pretense. The silence on the other end was immediate. "What about them?" "They're stopping?" I said. "Next month will be the last one." Her breath caught audibly. "What do you mean, stopping, Emma?" "There has to be some mistake. I can't cover the full payment on my own." "You know that." "I do," I said. "That's why this conversation is happening now." "But we had an understanding," she said, her voice rising. "This was temporary, until I got back on my feet. I'm so close. I just need more time." I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. I'd heard these words before, many times, always framed around the next milestone, the next opportunity that would fix everything. "It's been 2 years, Sarah." "That doesn't mean I'm not trying," she insisted. "The promotion could come through, and the renovation will add value. I'm making smart moves." "Smart moves don't rely on someone else paying your mortgage," I said quietly. She fell silent again, and I could almost hear the realization forming, slow and painful. "Are you doing this because of something I said?" she asked finally. "At dinner, yes," I replied honestly, and because of everything I didn't say. Her voice softened, edged with panic. "Emma, please, I can't lose this house. If Mom and Dad find out I can't afford it, It'll ruin me. That isn't mine to fix anymore, I said, my voice steady even as my heart raced. I helped you through a crisis. I can't keep funding a lifestyle you can't sustain, she cried then. Promises followed. New plans. Revised timelines. All the familiar patterns. I listened. Not unkindly, but without bending. When the call ended, my hands were shaking. But there was relief too. Deep and undeniable. For the first time in 2 years. The future felt uncertain. But it also felt honest. And that mattered more than comfort ever could. The days after that call stretched long and quiet, as if the world itself was giving Sarah time to absorb what I'd said. She didn't message me the next morning, or the one after that. The silence felt heavier than any argument could have. I went about my routine, answering emails, approving repairs, reviewing reports. But there was an undercurrent of tension that followed me everywhere. Ending the payments hadn't felt cruel. It had felt necessary. Still, necessity didn't erase the emotional weight of knowing someone you loved was about to face consequences they'd been avoiding for years. By midweek, the first message arrived. It wasn't an apology or a plan. It was a question, simple and desperate. Are you really serious about this? I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. Yes, that was all I sent. No explanations, no qualifiers, just the truth. That evening, I took a long walk through my neighborhood. The sidewalks were uneven, cracked in places, but solid. People passed with dogs, grocery bags, tired faces from long days at work. None of them knew my story, and I liked it that way. There was something grounding about anonymity. Out here, no one expected me to be anything other than myself. As I walked, I thought about Sarah's life, about how quickly success could turn into a performance when it became tied to identity. She hadn't just bought a house. She'd bought proof. Proof that she was responsible, accomplished, worthy of admiration. Losing that proof, or even admitting she couldn't afford it alone, felt like losing herself. Families often mistake appearance for stability. A big house looks solid from the outside. Even when the foundation is strained, rent looks temporary. Even when it supports long-term growth. We'd been taught those assumptions early, and Sarah had leaned into them fully. I'd quietly stepped away. The next call came 2 nights later. Sarah's voice was different this time. Lower, more controlled. I've been looking at my finances, she said. Really looking? I didn't realize how bad it was. I didn't respond immediately. I wanted to listen. I thought if I just held on long enough, something would change, she continued. A raise, a better offer, anything. I didn't think about what would happen if it didn't. That's the risk of building a life on hope instead of numbers, I said gently. She exhaled shakily. Mom and Dad can't know. Not yet. I closed my eyes. Sarah, this isn't just about money. It's about honesty. With them. And with yourself. She didn't argue. That alone told me how far things had shifted. Friday night. My parents called. Mom's voice was tentative, unusually careful. Sarah's been upset, she said. She says she's under a lot of stress at work. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. She is. Dad cleared his throat in the background. If there's something going on we should know about. We're here. The moment hovered, fragile and heavy. I could have told them everything right then. I could have ended the secrecy with a single sentence. But I knew it wasn't my confession to make. Not yet. I think Sarah needs to talk to you herself, I said finally. They didn't press. That surprised me. The call came 3 days later. Sarah asked everyone to come over. She called it important, urgent. When I arrived, the house felt different, tense. Sarah sat stiffly on the couch, hands clasped together. Her eyes were red, her smile forced. She didn't waste time. I need to tell you something, she said, her voice shaking. I've been struggling financially, more than I've let on. Mom leaned forward instantly. Oh, sweetheart, I can't afford my mortgage on my current salary. Sarah continued. I haven't been able to for a long time. The room went still. Dad frowned. What do you mean? I've been getting help, she said, her eyes flicking toward me briefly before returning to the floor. Emma's been paying my mortgage. The silence that followed felt unreal. like all the sound had been pulled from the room at once. Mom's mouth opened, then closed. Dad stared at me. Confusion etched across his face. You, he asked. How? I took a slow breath. I've been covering the payments for 2 years. Uncle Robert, who'd arrived late and was leaning against the doorway, let out a short, incredulous laugh. That doesn't make any sense. Emma doesn't. Dad stopped him with a raised hand, his gaze never leaving mine. Explain. So I did, not defensively, not dramatically. I explained what I owned, how I'd built it, how the payments were a fraction of my income. I explained calmly, methodically, the way I always did with numbers. Mom covered her mouth. Dad sank back into his chair. 17 properties, Uncle Robert repeated, as if saying it aloud might make it real. Yes, I said. Sarah cried quietly, embarrassment and relief tangled together. I didn't want you to know, she said to our parents. I didn't want to fail. Dad's face shifted through disbelief, shock, and finally something like regret. We've been wrong, he said slowly, about a lot of things. No one spoke for a long moment. The air felt heavy, but clearer somehow, like a storm had finally broken. Sarah looked at me then. She's stopping the payments, she said. I have to figure it out on my own. I nodded. You do. The room filled with a different kind of silence. Not the one that hides things, but the one that follows truth. That night, when I drove home, the city lights seemed brighter, sharper. I felt exhausted, but lighter. The secret was out. The illusion had cracked. And while nothing was fully resolved yet, one thing was clear. The story we'd all been telling ourselves was over. What came next would have to be real. The days that followed the family meeting felt strangely quiet, as if the world had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. No one called to argue. No one tried to rewrite what had already been said. The truth had landed, heavy and undeniable, and now it sat with each of us in different ways. I returned to my routine, but everything felt subtly altered, like furniture rearranged in a room you'd known by heart. Sarah didn't speak to me for a few days. I expected that. Shame has a way of creating distance, especially when it's exposed under bright lights. I didn't chase her. I'd done enough chasing over the years. If she reached out, it would have to be because she was ready, not because she felt cornered. My parents, on the other hand, called more than usual. Their questions were cautious at first, almost tentative, as if they were afraid the truth might vanish if they touched it too directly. Dad wanted to know how I'd started. Mom asked why I'd never said anything. The answers were simple, but not easy. I didn't need validation. I told them during one call, and every time I tried to explain what I was doing, it felt like you'd already decided who I was. There was a pause on the line, the kind that carried weight. We didn't see you, Mom said quietly. I didn't argue. That wasn't new information. What mattered was that she was seeing me now. Work continued, steady and predictable, the way I liked it. I finalized a new tenant lease, approved a roof repair, and reviewed a potential acquisition in a neighborhood just beginning to turn. The numbers were good, conservative, sustainable. I'd built my business deliberately, one step at a time, always prioritizing cash flow over appearance. It wasn't flashy, but it was resilient. And resilience, I'd learned, mattered far more than image. Midweek, Sarah finally called. I've been looking at my options, she said, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. None of them are great. That doesn't mean they're wrong, I replied. She sighed. I talked to a realtor. If I sell now, I might break even. Maybe a little equity left. That's not a failure, I said gently. That's information. She was silent for a moment. I don't know how I let it get this far. Because it's easy, I said. It's easy to believe the version of ourselves that other people praise. She didn't disagree. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah listed the house. Watching her go through that process was painful in a quiet way. Each open house, each conversation with potential buyers, chipped away at the identity she'd built around that place. She wasn't just selling a property. She was letting go of a story she'd been telling herself for years. The family dynamic shifted noticeably. At our next Sunday dinner, no one mentioned renovations or equity. The conversation was careful, almost tentative, like we were all learning how to talk again without leaning on old scripts. Dad asked me about rental markets. Mom asked how I managed risk. Uncle Robert listened more than he spoke. Sarah arrived late, like before, but the confidence was gone. She looked tired, but also more real. When dessert came, she surprised everyone by speaking up. "I've been living beyond my means," she said, staring into her coffee. And Emma was covering for me. No one interrupted her. That alone felt like progress. "I thought success was about keeping up," she continued. "About proving something. I didn't realize how much pressure I was under until it cracked." I didn't say anything. This was her moment, not mine. After dinner, she pulled me aside. "I'm sorry," she said simply. No excuses, no explanations. Just the words I hadn't known I needed to hear. "I accept," I replied. A month later, her house sold. The relief in her voice when she told me was unmistakable. She paid off her credit cards, set aside a modest emergency fund, and bought a small condo closer to work. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't impress anyone, but it fit, and that mattered. Helping her move was oddly grounding. We carried boxes up narrow stairs, laughed about old memories, and took breaks on the floor of her new living room. The space was smaller, but it felt lighter, less burdened by expectation. "I don't have to pretend here," she said, looking around. "I can actually afford this." "That's the point," I replied. The family continued adjusting. Dad stopped offering unsolicited advice. Mom asked before assuming. Uncle Robert asked me about investments with genuine curiosity, not judgment. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. Better. One evening, Sarah sent me a message. "First mortgage payment on the condo. Paid by me. Feels good." I smiled, setting the phone down, looking back. The hardest part of the entire experience hadn't been the money or the confrontation. It had been learning to say no without apology. To understand that support doesn't mean sacrifice without limits. That love doesn't require erasing yourself to preserve someone else's comfort. I'd spent years believing that silence was kindness, that keeping the peace was noble. But peace built on denial is fragile, and eventually, it collapses under its own weight. Now, as Sunday dinners slowly found a new rhythm, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Not triumph, not vindication, just calm. The kind that comes from living in alignment with your values, even when it's uncomfortable. Success, I'd learned, doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need witnesses. And it certainly doesn't need to be proven at a dinner table. It just needs to be real. And for the first time in years, it was. Time has a way of settling things when you stop forcing it. Weeks passed, then months, and the sharp edges of everything that had happened began to soften, not disappear, but smooth out, like stones in a river that keep their shape while losing their ability to cut. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. It became honest, and that was a different kind of comfort. Sunday dinners slowly found a new rhythm. The table was the same. The food tasted the same. But the air felt different, lighter. No one performed anymore. No one arrived armed with achievements to defend or comparisons to wield. Conversations wandered instead of competing. Dad talked about a book he was reading. Mom asked about my latest property acquisition without that familiar undertone of surprise. Sarah listened more than she spoke. And when she did speak, it was without the need to impress. I noticed something else too. Without the pressure to maintain an image, Sarah seemed quieter, but also steadier. The exhaustion that had once clung to her was easing. Living within her means had stripped away a layer of anxiety she hadn't even realized she was carrying. One evening, she invited me over to her new condo. It was modest, clean, and uncluttered. No echoing hallways. No rooms filled just to prove they could be. She'd chosen furniture carefully, intentionally, and every piece fit the space as if it belonged there. "I sleep better here," she admitted as we sat on the couch. "I used to wake up at 3 in the morning thinking about bills, about what would happen if something went wrong. Now I know exactly what comes in and what goes out. That's freedom," I said. She nodded. "I thought freedom looked like a bigger house." We sat in silence for a moment, comfortable this time. No history pressing between us, no debts unspoken. At work, Things continued to grow steadily. I closed on another small property. Nothing flashy, but well located and priced right. The kind of deal that wouldn't turn heads at a dinner party, but would quietly pay dividends for years. Janet congratulated me with her usual calm enthusiasm, and we discussed long-term maintenance strategies instead of celebrating. It was exactly how I liked it. My parents were changing too, though more slowly. Old habits don't disappear overnight. Sometimes Dad still caught himself offering advice before asking questions. Sometimes Mom slipped into worrying aloud about appearances. But they stopped assuming. They stopped filling in blanks with judgments. That alone felt like progress. One afternoon, Dad asked if we could talk. Just the two of us. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, staring into his coffee, "about how we measured success, about how wrong we were." I waited. "We thought struggle was visible," he continued, "and success was loud. We didn't understand that some people build quietly." I met his gaze. "That misunderstanding cost us time." He nodded, accepting that without defense. "I'm sorry. It wasn't dramatic. There were no tears. But it was sincere, and that mattered more." Later that week, Uncle Robert called. He asked about investing, about rental markets, about what he should avoid more than what he should chase. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I didn't point it out. People grow at their own pace. The biggest change, though, was internal. For years, I'd tied my sense of peace to being unseen, to staying out of the way, to not rocking the boat. I'd told myself that was humility, that it was maturity. But there's a difference between being humble and being invisible. I'd finally learned to tell them apart. Saying no had taught me something essential. Boundaries don't destroy relationships when they're built on truth. They reveal which ones can survive without illusion. One night, as I reviewed my finances before bed, I noticed something small but significant. The line item that had once represented Sarah's mortgage payment was gone. The numbers balanced without it, just as they always had. But emotionally, the absence felt symbolic. A chapter closed. A pattern broken. Sarah texted me later that evening. "I got a raise today. Not huge, but enough to make things easier." I smiled, proud. Not because she was earning more, but because she was standing on her own. That night, I slept deeply. No rehearsed conversations, no quiet resentment, just rest. Looking back, I realized something simple and powerful. The moment I stopped financing someone else's illusion, I started living fully inside my own reality. And that reality didn't need approval, applause, or comparison. It just needed space to breathe. Autumn arrived quietly that year, the way it often does when you're no longer measuring time by crisis. Leaves gathered along sidewalks, mornings turned crisp, and the city took on a slower, steadier rhythm. I noticed it more than usual. When your mind is no longer braced for the next emotional impact, you start to see details again. Small things, honest things. Sarah was adjusting, not dramatically, not with grand declarations, but with subtle shifts that told me more than words ever could. She tracked her spending now. She talked about numbers instead of dreams. When she mentioned work, it was about projects she enjoyed, not titles she hoped would impress. The urgency had faded from her voice, replaced by something steadier. Acceptance, maybe, or relief. One evening, she called me unexpectedly. There was no crisis in her tone this time, no edge of panic, just hesitation. "I've been thinking about everything," she said. "About us. About what I put you through." I listened. "I don't think I realized how much I depended on you," she continued. "Not just financially, emotionally. Knowing you were there made it easier to avoid reality." "That's not all on you," I replied. "I let it happen." "I know," she said softly, "but I still need to say it. I'm sorry." I closed my eyes, letting the words settle. Apologies don't erase the past, but they can soften it, reshape it into something less sharp. "Thank you," I said. "That matters." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment and thought about how rarely families talk about dependency honestly. It's usually disguised as loyalty, obligation, love, but unexamined dependence can quietly corrode relationships, turning support into expectation. generosity into resentment. I'd learned that lesson the long way. At work, the market was shifting slightly. Interest rates had nudged upward, making acquisitions more selective. I liked that. Pressure had a way of revealing fundamentals. I passed on a few deals that would have stretched cash flow too thin, choosing patience over expansion. It reminded me of the choice I'd made with Sarah. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. My parents were still finding their footing in this new version of our family. Old patterns surfaced occasionally, usually when stress was high. One Sunday, Dad started to comment on someone else's career choice with that familiar tone of judgment. He caught himself mid-sentence and stopped. "That's not fair," he said quietly. "Ignore me." Mom glanced at him, surprised, then smiled faintly. Progress didn't always come in sweeping changes. Sometimes it arrived in interrupted sentences. That night, after dinner, Mom asked if I'd stay back for tea. We sat at the kitchen table, steam rising gently from our cups. "I keep thinking about how we missed it," she said. "Your success, your discipline, all of it. You didn't miss it." I replied. "You just didn't recognize it." She nodded, eyes damp. We equated struggle with failure, and silence with weakness. I reached for her hand. I didn't speak up. "You shouldn't have had to," she said. There it was. Not an excuse, not a defense, just acknowledgment. It felt like something settling into place. As winter approached, Sarah invited the family to her condo for dinner. It was a simple meal. Pasta, salad, bread she'd picked up on the way home. Nothing fancy. No presentations, no speeches. And somehow, it was one of the most comfortable gatherings we'd had in years. At one point, Uncle Robert asked about my work, genuinely curious, not impressed. Curious. I explained a recent acquisition, the numbers behind it, why I'd passed on another opportunity. He listened, nodding slowly. "I always thought wealth was about taking big swings," he said. "Turns out it's about knowing when not to." I smiled. "Most of the time, yes." Sarah caught my eye from across the table. There was no embarrassment there now, no defensiveness, just a quiet understanding of everything we'd been through. Later that night, she walked me to the door. "I'm glad you stopped," she said suddenly. I raised an eyebrow. "Stopped what?" "Saving me," she said. I needed to learn how to save myself. I considered that for a moment. We both did. Driving home, I felt something rare and unfamiliar. Contentment without tension. The story that had once defined us had loosened its grip. We weren't the family we used to be. We were something new, still imperfect, but more grounded in truth. In my apartment, I reviewed my finances out of habit. Not worry. The numbers made sense. The plans felt aligned. There was space now, not just in my budget, but in my mind. Before bed, my phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. "I set up automatic savings today. It's small, but it's mine." I smiled, placed the phone face down, and turned off the light. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like something to manage or defend against. It felt like something to walk toward, steadily, honestly, without carrying anyone else's weight. Winter settled in fully, the kind that muffled sound and slowed everything down. Snow softened the edges of the city, turning familiar streets into quieter versions of themselves. I liked winter for that reason. It asked less of you. It encouraged stillness, reflection, and honesty. There was nowhere to rush to when the world itself seemed to pause. With the holidays approaching, family gatherings became more frequent. But they felt different now. Less ceremonial, less performative. The old tension that once hovered at the table had faded into something gentler. We talked about ordinary things, work stress, weather, plans that didn't revolve around proving anything to anyone. At one dinner, Dad surprised me by asking a question he'd never asked before. "What made you choose real estate?" There was no judgment in his voice, just curiosity. I thought for a moment before answering. It made sense to me. Tangible assets, predictable cash flow. I liked the idea of building something quietly. He nodded, absorbing that. "We always thought quiet meant unsure. Sometimes it means focused," I said. Mom smiled softly. She'd been doing that more lately, as if she was seeing me anew and didn't want to miss a thing. Sarah, meanwhile, was navigating her new life with cautious confidence. She no longer spoke in sweeping plans or 5-year visions. Her goals were smaller now, but more grounded. She talked about saving for emergencies, about learning to say no to herself when temptation crept in. It wasn't dramatic growth, but it was real. One afternoon, she called me while I was reviewing a lease renewal. "I almost booked a vacation I couldn't afford," she admitted, half laughing. "Old habits." "What did you do?" I asked. "I didn't book it," she said. I sat with the feeling instead. "Turns out I wanted the escape more than the trip." I smiled. That awareness alone told me how far she'd come. As the year drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in such a short span of time. Not externally. Perhaps my apartment was the same, my car was the same, my work looked much as it always had, but internally, everything felt different, lighter, more aligned. One evening, as snow fell steadily outside, I sat at my desk and reviewed my long-term plans, not just financial ones, but personal ones too. For the first time, I wasn't factoring in how my choices might be perceived by my family. I wasn't anticipating commentary or comparison. I was simply asking myself what I wanted. That question, I realized, had been missing from my life for a long time. I wanted stability. I wanted freedom. I wanted relationships that didn't depend on silence or sacrifice. None of those things required explanation or approval. A few days later, Sarah invited me for coffee. We met at a small cafe near her condo, tucked between a bookstore and a florist. It was warm inside, the windows fogged from the contrast with the cold outside. "I've been thinking about something," she said, stirring her drink. "About how we grew up." I waited. "I think I learned early that love came with expectations," she continued. That being impressive meant being valued. I didn't realize how much of my identity was built around that. "That's a heavy thing to carry," I said. She nodded. "I'm still unlearning it." We sat in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't demand filling. When we parted ways, she hugged me, something she hadn't done in years without awkwardness. It felt genuine, unforced. The holidays came and went quietly, no dramatic moments, no speeches, just shared meals and simple exchanges. Dad laughed more. Mom listened more. Uncle Robert talked less and observed more. And I noticed something important. No one made assumptions anymore. When they didn't know something, they asked. On New Year's Eve, I stayed in. I watched the city lights from my window as fireworks bloomed in the distance. I thought about the year behind me, about the boundaries I'd set and the truth I'd chosen. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been comfortable, but it had been necessary. At midnight, my phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "Thank you for this year, for everything, especially for letting me fail safely." I stared at the words for a long moment. Fail safely. That was it. That was what I'd offered. Not endless rescue, but the space to learn without being abandoned. And in doing so, I'd given myself the same gift. I replied simply, "We both grew." As the new year began, I felt something I hadn't expected. Gratitude. Not for the struggle itself, but for what it had revealed. For the clarity it had forced. For the strength it had uncovered in all of us. The future was still uncertain. It always would be. But uncertainty no longer felt threatening. It felt honest. I turned off the lights, letting the quiet settle in around me, and went to bed knowing one thing with absolute certainty. The story of being the family disappointment was over, and the story that replaced it didn't need a title at all. It was just my life, finally lived on my own terms. Spring arrived gently, without announcement, the way meaningful change often does. The snow melted into narrow streams along the sidewalks. Trees pushed out tentative green buds, and the city seemed to breathe a little easier. I felt it too. That subtle sense of renewal that didn't demand celebration, only acknowledgement. Life had settled into something steady, not static, but balanced. My days were full without being frantic. Mornings started with coffee and quiet. Afternoons with decisions that felt grounded instead of rushed. I no longer measured progress by how busy I was, but by how clear my mind felt when the day ended. Sarah continued finding her footing. She still called occasionally with questions, but they were different now, no longer panicked, no longer seeking rescue. She asked about budgeting strategies, about emergency funds, about how to think long-term without building castles in the air. I answered when I could, careful not to cross the line back into managing her life for her. One afternoon, she asked something that surprised me. "How did you know when to stop helping?" There was no accusation in her voice, just curiosity. "I didn't," I said honestly. "I just knew when continuing would hurt us both." She was quiet for a moment. "I think that's what I'm still learning. The difference between support and escape. That difference takes time," I said, "and practice." My parents were learning too, in their own way. Dad had started reading about investing, not because he planned to overhaul his finances, but because he wanted to understand the world I'd been operating in for years. Mom asked questions about my work without framing them around concern or doubt. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was consistent, and consistency mattered. One Sunday afternoon, Dad and I took a walk together after lunch. We moved slowly, matching each other's pace. He spoke first. "I used to think I was motivating you," he said, "pushing you to aim higher." I nodded, letting him continue. "I see now that I was pushing you toward my idea of success," he said, "not yours." I stopped walking and looked at him. "That happens more than people realize." He sighed. "I wish I'd understood sooner." "So do I said gently, "but understanding now still counts." He smiled faintly, and we continued walking. The silence between us no longer heavy, but thoughtful. At work, I finalized plans for the year ahead. Nothing flashy. A few strategic acquisitions. Some renovations focused on longevity rather than aesthetics. The market remained unpredictable, but I'd built my business to withstand that. The same principles applied to life. Build for what lasts. Avoid unnecessary risk. Don't confuse movement with progress. One evening, while reviewing my finances, I noticed something else had changed. Not the numbers themselves, but how I felt about them. There was no tension attached anymore. No sense of carrying hidden weight. Everything on the screen reflected choices I'd made consciously. Without obligation or secrecy, it felt clean. Sarah invited the family to dinner again, this time to celebrate a small milestone. She'd finished paying off the last of her credit card debt. The meal was simple, home-cooked, and warm in a way that had nothing to do with presentation. When she shared the news, there was no applause, just smiles and quiet pride. "I used to think success had to be impressive," she said, glancing at me briefly. "Now I think it just has to be sustainable." I smiled, recognizing the truth in her words. After dinner, as we cleared dishes together, she leaned closer. "I'm glad you didn't save me," she said quietly. I raised an eyebrow. "You say that now?" She laughed softly. "I mean it. You forced me to face reality, and reality turned out to be survivable. That's usually how it goes," I said. Later that night, driving home, I reflected on how far we'd all come, not in accomplishments or assets, but in understanding. The family dynamic had been rewired, not perfectly, but intentionally. We were no longer pretending, and that alone had changed everything. At home, I opened my notebook again, the one I'd used months earlier when everything felt uncertain. I flipped to a blank page and wrote a single sentence. "Boundaries are acts of care, not rejection." I closed the notebook and set it aside, feeling no need to add more. Before bed, my phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "Just set up my retirement account. It's small, but it's real." I replied with a simple thumbs up and a smile I didn't have to force. As I turned off the lights, I realized something else. I no longer felt the need to explain myself, to justify my choices, to prove anything. The quiet confidence I'd built over years had finally found space to exist openly, without apology. The past had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. The future wasn't something to fear or manage aggressively. It was something to meet with steadiness and intention. And for the first time, that felt like more than enough. By early summer, the changes that once felt fragile had become habits. Not the kind you have to remind yourself to keep, but the kind that settle into your body and guide you without effort. The air grew warmer. Evenings stretched longer, and with them came a new ease in how we moved around one another as a family. There was less carefulness now, less tiptoeing. We were no longer afraid that honesty might shatter something. We'd already survived that moment. Sarah invited me to join her for a walk one Saturday morning. The neighborhood around her condo was waking up slowly. Shop owners lifting metal gates, cyclists gliding past, the smell of coffee drifting out of open doors. We walked side by side without urgency, the way people do when they're not trying to arrive anywhere in particular. "I used to think you were hiding," she said suddenly, "keeping secrets." I glanced at her. "And now I think you are protecting yourself," she said. "And maybe protecting me too. In a way that wasn't fair to either of us." I nodded. I didn't know another way back then. She kicked a small stone along the sidewalk, watching it roll ahead of us. "I wish I'd asked more questions. About your life. About what you were building." "I wish I'd answered," I said. "But we're here now." That felt like enough. Work had entered a new phase as well. Not expansion for expansion's sake, but refinement. I sold one property that no longer fit my strategy and reinvested the equity into 2 smaller units with stronger cash flow. It wasn't a dramatic move, but it was a smart one, the kind that aligns with patience instead of ego. When Janet congratulated me, I realized I felt something different this time. Not pride. Exactly. More like quiet satisfaction. Alignment. My parents continued adjusting. Mom had started telling friends about my work with a calm confidence that surprised me. Not boastful, not apologetic, just factual. Dad asked thoughtful questions before offering opinions. He listened. Sometimes he even changed his mind. Watching that unfold felt like witnessing a slow, careful repair. One afternoon, Mom asked if I'd help her organize old photo albums. We sat on the living room floor, flipping through pages of glossy memories. Birthdays, holidays, vacations. In so many of the photos, Sarah was front and center, smiling broadly, arms thrown wide. I was often to the side, half smiling. Already accustomed to being peripheral, I didn't notice then. Mom said quietly, tracing a finger along the edge of one photo, "How you always made space for everyone else." I didn't respond right away. Some truths don't need immediate answers. "I'm noticing now," she added. That mattered. As the weeks passed, the family dinners took on a new tone. They weren't platforms for achievement anymore. They were conversations, sometimes messy, sometimes awkward, but real. Sarah talked openly about her budget wins and struggles. Dad shared stories from work without turning them into lessons. Uncle Robert listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, it was with curiosity instead of commentary. One evening, after dessert, Sarah looked at me and smiled in a way that felt unburdened. "You know what's strange?" she said. "I used to feel like I had to be impressive to be loved. Now I just feel present." I smiled back. Presence lasts longer. Later that night, at home, I sat on my balcony and watched the city wind down. Lights flickered on in apartments across the street, each window holding a life I'd never fully know. I thought about how easily we judge from the outside, how often we confuse noise with progress, size with security, confidence with competence. I'd done it too, in my own way, by assuming silence was safer than truth. A message came in from Sarah while I was lost in thought. I just turned down a job offer that paid more but would have made me miserable. First time I've ever done that. I typed back slowly, "That's a powerful choice." She replied a moment later. It felt terrifying. And right, I set the phone down, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the evening air. Growth doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's just a quiet decision made differently than before. As summer deepened, I realized something else had shifted. I no longer felt responsible for managing how others perceived me. Their opinions mattered less, not because I didn't care, but because they were no longer defining. I'd stepped out of the role I'd been assigned and into one I'd chosen. One night, before bed, I opened my notebook again and flipped through old pages. Questions, doubts, half-formed realizations. I smiled at the version of myself who'd written them, who'd been brave enough to ask but not yet ready to answer. On a new page, I wrote another sentence. Living quietly is not the same as living small. I closed the notebook and set it aside. The family wasn't perfect now, neither was I, but perfection had never been the goal. What we had was honesty, boundaries, and the willingness to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. That was more than enough to build something sustainable. As I turned off the lights, I felt steady in a way that didn't depend on circumstances. Whatever came next, I knew this much. I would meet it without pretending, without shrinking, and without carrying weight that wasn't mine to bear. That was the kind of success no one could take away. Late summer carried a different kind of light. Softer, slower. The days still held warmth, but the urgency of earlier months had faded, replaced by a calm that felt earned rather than accidental. I noticed it most in the mornings, when I woke without that faint tension I'd carried for years, the one that used to sit in my chest like an unanswered question. Life hadn't become simpler, it had become clearer, and clarity, I was learning, was far more valuable. Work continued its steady rhythm. I finalized another lease renewal, passed on a tempting but misaligned investment, and scheduled long overdue maintenance on one of the older properties. These weren't dramatic choices, but they were consistent with the way I now moved through everything else, thoughtfully, intentionally, without the need to impress anyone, including myself. One afternoon, as I was reviewing documents, my phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. First mortgage payment on the condo just went through, entirely from my account. No stress, no panic, just paid. I stared at the words longer than necessary, letting them sink in, not because of the payment itself, but because of what it represented. Independence, ownership, reality faced and handled. I typed back, proud of you. A moment later, 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Thank you. For everything. And for stopping when you did. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. Closure doesn't always come with a dramatic final conversation. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a single sentence that lands exactly where it needs to. That evening, the family gathered for dinner once more. It wasn't a special occasion. No announcements, no milestones. Just a meal. Sarah arrived carrying a simple dessert from a local bakery. Not homemade, not extravagant. Mom hugged her without fuss. Dad asked about her week without turning it into an evaluation. Uncle Robert talked about a book he was reading instead of offering commentary on anyone's life choices. At some point, as we were clearing plates, Sarah looked at me and smiled. Not the polished smile she used to wear like armor, but a relaxed one that didn't ask for approval. I returned it easily. Later, sitting on the back porch as the sun dipped low, Dad spoke again. I've been thinking about how we talk about success, he said, almost to himself, about what we reward, what we overlook. I didn't rush to respond. We praised what we could see, he continued, and ignored what required patience to understand. That's common, I said. Visibility is easier than depth, he nodded, accepting that without defensiveness. I'm glad you didn't become louder just to be noticed. So was I. When I got home that night, I didn't open my laptop. I didn't review numbers or plans. I made tea and sat by the window, watching the city settle into itself. The hum of traffic, the glow of streetlights, the quiet choreography of lives unfolding beyond my reach. For the first time, I didn't feel separate from it all. I felt grounded within it. I thought about the version of myself from 2 years ago. The one who transferred money every month without question. The one who absorbed comments and judgments in silence. The one who believed that keeping the peace required self-erasure. I didn't feel anger toward her. I felt compassion. She did the best she could with what she understood at the time. Growth doesn't always look like addition. Sometimes it looks like subtraction. Removing illusions. Removing roles that no longer fit. Removing the weight of expectations that were never yours to carry. A few days later, Sarah called again, this time just to talk. She told me about a project at work she was excited about, not because it would look good on paper, but because it challenged her in a way that felt meaningful. She talked about learning to say no, about discovering that her worth didn't evaporate when she stopped proving it. "I don't think I ever thanked you properly," she said near the end of the call. "You don't need to," I replied. "Just keep going." And she would. I knew that now. As the season edged closer to fall, I found myself thinking less about what had happened and more about what it had taught me. That success built quietly is still success. That generosity without boundaries can become a burden. That family dynamics don't change through confrontation alone, but through consistency and truth. Most importantly, I learned that living modestly by choice is not the same as living small, and that silence, while sometimes protective, should never come at the cost of self-respect. On the first cool evening of September, I took a long walk through my neighborhood. The air carried that early hint of autumn, the promise of change without urgency. I felt steady, not triumphant, not vindicated, just at peace, back home. I opened my notebook one last time and flipped to the final blank page. I didn't write a list or a plan. I wrote a single line, then closed it. You don't owe anyone a performance to justify your life. I turned off the light and lay down, the city breathing softly around me. The chapter that had once defined me had closed, not with bitterness, but with understanding. What came next didn't need to be announced or explained. It would simply be lived. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If this journey resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own strength, your own silent battles, or the moment you finally chose yourself, then this story was meant for you. Stories like this are shared here to remind us that reclaiming our voice is never selfish, and standing in our truth is never wrong. If you want to hear more powerful stories about resilience, justice, self-worth, and the courage to break free, don't forget to subscribe to the channel Vengeance Within. Your support helps us continue bringing stories that matter, stories that give strength, and stories that remind us who we really are. Until the next story, take care of yourself, and remember, your worth is never defined by anyone else.